The summer of 213 before the Common Era brought to the shores of Sicily the most powerful fleet the Western Mediterranean had seen in decades. 60 Roman king-karims cut through the blue waters off Syracuse, and the consul Marcus Claudius Marcellus surveyed those walls from the deck with the calm certainty of a man who knows that victory is merely a matter of time. Rome needed Syracuse, and Rome always got what it needed. But what awaited the legions in that harbor was not fear nor surrender. It was a 75-year-old man bent over wax tablets, tracing angles that no one else in the world was capable of understanding. It was the concentrated genius of an entire life devoted to deciphering the secrets of the universe. And his creations lay dormant on the walls like silent beasts ready to wake. And when the Roman galleys advanced toward the great harbor, the silence shattered into 1,000 pieces. Enormous stone blocks fell from the heights like meteors. The iron claw rose from the battlements and seized an entire quinquereme, tearing it from the water. The ship spun through the air. Men and oars flew in every direction. The catapult spat salvo after salvo, calibrated for every distance, not a single shot wasted. Roman shields burst apart, hulls sank, the sea turned red. The most seasoned soldiers in the world fled in panic, terrified by an enemy they could neither see nor reach. When the sun sank behind the great harbor on that first evening, the invincible fleet of Rome was retreating in defeat, and the man who had destroyed it remained in his workshop, oblivious to the chaos, calculating the next angle. That siege would last 2 years, and what happened beneath those walls would forever change the way the world understood war, genius, and the irreplaceable price of wisdom. To understand what happened at Syracuse, one must first understand the world surrounding it. The year 213 before the Common Era was not a time of peace or tranquil greatness. It was the very heart of the deepest chaos the Mediterranean had experienced in centuries. The Second Punic War blazed on every front. Hannibal Barca, the most brilliant Carthaginian general of his generation, had crossed the Alps with his army and had been devastating Italy for 3 years. At Cannae in 216, his forces annihilated 8 Roman legions in a single afternoon, killing perhaps 70,000 soldiers on the bloodiest battlefield of the ancient world. Rome trembled, not politically. It trembled in its very foundations, in its homes, in the faith of its citizens. And yet the Republic did not surrender. In that context of extreme fragility, every lost ally was a potentially fatal wound. Sicily was the first Roman province outside Italy, wrested from Carthage during the First Punic War, which had lasted from 264 to 241. Its geographical position made it the key to the Western Mediterranean. Whoever controlled Sicily controlled the sea routes between Rome, North Africa, and the Iberian Peninsula. And on the southeastern tip of the island, on a promontory flanked by 2 natural harbors, rose Syracuse, the largest Greek city in the Western world, a metropolis of legendary wealth with walls that no army had managed to take for centuries. For 25 years, King Hero II had governed Syracuse with exceptional prudence, maintaining a fruitful alliance with Rome that guaranteed prosperity and peace. Under his reign, the city flourished. Its harbors teemed with commerce. Its temples grew. Its theaters rang with Greek tragedies and comedies. And in that atmosphere of enlightened patronage, one singular man found the space and the resources to devote himself entirely to the activity he loved, above all else, pure thought. That man was Archimedes. When Hero II died in 215, Syracuse entered a zone of dangerous instability. His grandson Hieronymus came to the throne as little more than a boy, surrounded by advisors who saw in the catastrophic Roman defeat at Cannae the opportunity to change sides. If Hannibal was going to destroy Rome, what better moment to join Carthage? Hieronymus signed the Carthaginian alliance. Shortly afterward he was assassinated, but the generals Hippocrates and Epicides, skillful manipulators of Syracusan public opinion, managed to keep the city in Carthage's orbit. For Rome, this was unacceptable. The Senate declared war, and the man chosen to retake Syracuse was Marcus Claudius Marcellus, the consul his own soldiers called the Sword of Rome. Marcellus was a warrior of the old school, famous for his victory in single combat against the Gallic king Viridomarus in 222, the last time a Roman general personally killed an enemy chieftain in direct battle. He was fierce, disciplined, and absolutely certain of himself. When he arrived in Sicily, commanding a fleet of 60 quinqueremes, supported by a land army, he calculated that Syracuse would fall within weeks. The plan was a coordinated assault. The fleet would attack from the great harbour, while the legions of his colleague Appius Claudius Pulcher pressed from land. A textbook maneuver that had worked dozens of times against dozens of cities. What Marcellus did not adequately reckon with was that Syracuse had more than walls and soldiers. It had Archimedes. Archimedes of Syracuse was born around 287 before the Common Era, according to the tradition transmitted by the Byzantine historian John Tzetzes. He was, therefore, a man of approximately 75 years when Marcellus's galleys appeared on the horizon. An old man by the reckoning of that era. But age had not touched his mind. If anything, it had sharpened it. What we know of his character comes from scattered fragments in Plutarch, Polybius, and Livy, and the portrait that emerges from those texts is of a man who inhabited a parallel universe. Plutarch describes how Archimedes forgot to eat when absorbed in a problem, how he had to be physically dragged to the bath, how he drew geometric figures in the ashes of the hearth, in the oil on his own skin, on any available surface. This was not distraction born of weakness of character, it was extreme concentration, the capacity to shut out the external world entirely, while the mind navigated territories no other human being had explored. He was a cousin of King Hero II, or at least close to the royal family, and that relationship had guaranteed him decades of patronage and intellectual freedom. The king would set him practical problems, and Archimedes solved them almost as a minor exercise, a warm-up before the real work. Pure geometry, infinitesimals, the calculation of areas and volumes that 2 millennia later Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz would independently rediscover. Archimedes had calculated the value of pi with a precision that would not be surpassed in the West for centuries. He had demonstrated that the volume of a sphere inscribed in a cylinder is exactly 2/3 of the cylinder's volume. He had invented the endless screw that still bears his name. He had explained with mathematical precision the principle of the lever and pronounced the phrase that would become legendary across the ages: "Give me a place to stand, and I will move the world." But Archimedes was not a man of war. He was deeply repelled by the military application of his genius. According to Plutarch, he considered the design of combat machines a base occupation, unworthy of true philosophy. He did it out of duty to his city, not by vocation, and yet, when he set himself to the task, what he built exceeded any weapon the ancient world had ever beheld. Opposite him stood Marcus Claudius Marcellus, at the height of his physical and institutional power. The contrast could not have been sharper. A man of action, at the peak of his career against an absent-minded old man who lived among numbers. A general who had won battles with muscle and discipline against a geometer who won wars with imagination. Marcellus was not a simple man. He was brilliant in his own way, a flexible strategist capable of changing tactics when the situation demanded it. But never before had he faced anything like what Syracuse had prepared for him. And there was a third actor in this story that memory tends to forget: the people of Syracuse. Not the Carthaginian generals who governed the city, nor the aristocrats who calculated their interests, but the ordinary citizens who lived beneath the walls, the fishermen of the great harbor, the women who filled amphorae at the public fountains, the craftsmen surrounded by the sound of metal and wood. They too would defend their city, and in their hearts the figure of Archimedes was something more than an engineer. He was the living guarantee that the mind can surpass muscle, that a city which thinks can survive the assault of an empire that only strikes. The Roman fleet arrived off the coast of Syracuse in the spring of 213. It was a spectacle designed to intimidate. 60 warships, each with 5 rows of oarsmen coordinated in mechanical perfection, advanced in formation across the blue waters of the Mediterranean. On the decks, the sambucas were deployed, floating siege towers mounted on platforms of 8 chained ships together, equipped with scaling ladders that could be raised to reach the battlements. Every ship also carried archers, slingers, and javelin throwers. It was Roman military engineering at its highest expression. From the walls, the defenders watched them. Archimedes watched them too, but not with the same eyes. He saw moving masses, potential levers, angles of fire, calculable distances. While the citizens of Syracuse felt the weight of fear settling in their stomachs, the old geometer saw a problem of applied physics. And he already had the solution, because Archimedes had not spent recent years in idleness. Hiero II, in his wisdom, had commissioned him decades earlier to modernize the city's defenses. The wall of Dionysius, the great barrier protecting the plateau of Epipolae, had been reinforced and fitted with positions for war machines. The sea walls had been equipped with firing systems designed for multiple ranges. Archimedes' catapults were not the conventional machines the Romans knew, with a fixed range and slow rate of fire. They were instruments calibrated with mathematical precision, capable of adjusting their reach according to the distance of the target without recalibration between shots. Machines for distant targets, machines for mid-range targets, and machines for close combat directly beneath the wall itself. A layered artillery with no blind zone. And then there was the claw. The claw of Archimedes was a crane mounted on the harbor wall, fitted with an iron hook of extraordinary proportions suspended by chains. When a ship drew too close to the wall, the operator lowered the hook, which caught on the prow or the keel of the vessel. Then, through a complex system of pulleys and counterweights based on the mathematical principles Archimedes had spent decades perfecting, the machine lifted the ship out of the water. It hoisted it upward. It held it suspended over the void. And then it let go. No one in Rome knew this existed. No one in the world had seen it before. The weeks before the attack were ones of mounting tension within Syracuse. Markets emptied, temples filled. The priests of Zeus and Artemis received offerings that had not arrived in such abundance for years. Mothers kept their children inside the houses. Men sharpened swords they might never use, because the real defense lay in the hands of an old man and his machines. Hippocrates and Epicides walked the walls, counted provisions, sent messengers to Carthage begging for reinforcements. But in their hearts, everyone in Syracuse knew that their most immediate fate depended on something without precedent in military history. The inventions of a mathematician. Archimedes slept little in those days, or perhaps he slept exactly as he always had, because for him, the distinction between work and rest was blurred. His assistants saw him pass entire nights by lamplight, adjusting calculations, modifying angles, optimizing the firing mechanisms. He did not speak of victory or defeat. He spoke of tensions, parabolic trajectories, the ratio between the weight of a projectile and the length of the throwing arm. For him, war at that moment was a problem of physics, and problems of physics had solutions. It was at dawn that Marcellus gave the signal to attack. The 60 quinqueremes advanced toward the great harbor in tight formation, their prows cutting the water with the confidence of men who had done this 100 times. The Sambucas deployed, their ladders aimed at the harbour walls. On the ships, thousands of legionaries in full armour prepared to climb. From land, the cohorts of Appius Claudius Pulcher advanced on the northern walls. It was the most massive coordinated assault Syracuse had seen in generations. For a moment, there was silence. And then the sky was torn apart. The long-range catapults fired first, launching barrel-sized rocks that swept through the air with a deep moan and fell on the advancing fleet. The splashes raised columns of water. One ship took a direct hit on the deck, and its masts splintered like straw. The oarsmen lost their rhythm. The formations began to break apart, and before the Roman captains could reorganize their lines, the mid-range machines entered the fight. Immense stones fell with incredible din and force, knocking down in heaps those who stood in their way and throwing their ranks into confusion. Roman shields held against arrows and javelins. They did not hold against 20-kilogram blocks launched at catapult velocity, but the worst was reserved for the fleet. When the Quinqueremes attempted to close with the harbour walls to deploy their Sambucas, the claw came into action. The first ship that drew too near felt a sudden violent jolt at its prow. The iron hook had descended from the battlements and driven into the wood with a force no oarsman could resist. The chains went taut, the pulleys turned, and the ship, a warship with a full complement of 300 men, began to rise from the water. The crew did not understand what was happening. There was no training that could have prepared them for it, because no one had ever seen anything like it. The ship tilted, first gently, then violently. The men slid toward the prow. The oars hung in the air. The sea lay below like a distant mirror. And when the machine had raised them high enough, when the entire ship hung suspended over the harbour like some grotesque offering, the claw released it. The impact with the water was like a thunderclap. Plutarch conveys these moments with the vividness of one who had access to direct testimony. Frequently, too, a ship would be lifted out of the water into mid-air, whirled hither and thither as it hung there, a dreadful spectacle, until its crew had been thrown out and hurled in all directions, after which it would fall empty upon the walls or slip away from the clutch that had held it. Ship after ship, again and again. The most powerful fleet ever to sail the Western Mediterranean was becoming a field of incomprehensible destruction. The soldiers who survived the initial impact and swam to neighboring vessels found only more chaos. The Scorpions, small catapults fixed at loopholes in the wall, fired bursts of multiple darts that swept the decks clean. The wind carried the smell of burning wood. Some machines hurled enormous weights that fell on the Sambucas and smashed them before they could deploy their ladders. Marcellus watched from his flagship with a mixture of astonishment and horror that Plutarch captures in a memorable detail. The general, trying to maintain composure before his officers, made a bitter joke. "Must we not give up fighting with this geometrical Briareus, who uses my ships to ladle seawater into his wine cups?" But the joke could not conceal what every man in the Roman fleet could see. The invincible squadron of Rome had been defeated on the water by an old man and his geometry. The land assault fared no better. The legions of Appius Claudius Pulcher advanced on the walls of the Hexapolae sector with the characteristic discipline of Roman formations. Testudo formations locked, shields overlapped. The advance was methodical and ordered. But Archimedes' catapults were prepared for this attack as well. Enormous stones crashed down on the closed formations with brutal efficiency. Soldiers who managed to close with the walls found a hail of close-range projectiles, fired from loopholes calculated precisely for that distance, cutting them down before they could set their ladders. Polybius, the Greek historian who had access to first-hand testimony, wrote that the Romans, having brought up numerous forces both by sea and by land, had every hope of capturing the city immediately, if only one old man out of all the Syracusans could have been removed. But so long as he was present, They did not dare even to attempt an attack by any method which made it possible for Archimedes to oppose them. It was an acknowledgement without precedent in the military annals of Rome. An army of the Republic admitted, plainly and without euphemism, that the mind of a single man was more powerful than all its machinery of war. After days of failed attempts, Marcellus made the only tactical decision left to him: suspend direct assaults and turn the siege into a blockade. If Syracuse could not be taken by force, it would be strangled. He cut the overland supply routes. His fleet sealed the harbor, and he waited. The fear that Archimedes had planted in the Roman soldiers transcended the logic of the battlefield. Men who had fought at the Trebia, at Lake Trasimene, at Cannae, who had watched their companions die at Hannibal's hands without breaking, fled in panic at the sight of a rope or a beam projecting slightly above the battlements. Plutarch records the detail with precision. The soldiers cried out that Archimedes was training some engine upon them, and turned their backs and fled. The most disciplined warriors in the world were reduced to terror by the mere possibility of his inventions, but the waiting had its own dangers. A Carthaginian army under the general Himilco arrived in Sicily to try to lift the siege. For a time, Marcellus found himself caught between two forces, Syracuse at his back and the Carthaginians ahead. The situation grew still more complicated when a fever epidemic devastated the Carthaginian army in the marshes of southern Sicily, killing thousands of men, including Himilco himself. Fortune, which for months had favored the defenders, began slowly to tilt toward Rome. During the long months of the blockade, Archimedes continued his work, not on the war machines, which were already built and in position, but on his usual studies. There are accounts that even during the siege, he continued writing mathematical treatises, solving theoretical problems that had no immediate practical application. As if the war were a phenomenon occurring around him, but not inside him. His mind was always elsewhere, in a space where angles were perfect and ratios were exact, and the universe obeyed laws that he alone in his era was capable of formulating with absolute precision. Outside the walls, hunger began its silent work. Months passed. Autumn came, then winter, then a new spring. Syracuse held, but each week the margin of survival grew thinner. The Carthaginians sent naval reinforcements, but Marcellus dispersed them. The Sicilian cities allied to Syracuse fell one by one to Roman control. The siege tightened like a noose, and then came the night of the festival of Artemis. It was the year 212. The Syracusans, with the confidence that settles in those who have held out so long against all expectations, were celebrating their sacred festival. The temples were lit, wine flowed, the guard relaxed, the men on the walls drank in honor of the goddess, while in the Roman camp someone was passing to Marcellus information that would change the fate of the city. In the darkness of that night, a small party of elite Roman soldiers moved silently toward the northwestern section of the walls. No drums, no torches, in complete silence. They scaled the walls at points that traitors inside had pointed out to them. The few sentries they encountered were eliminated without a sound. More soldiers followed, and before the defenders could react, a gate in the wall was opened from within. Dawn found the Roman legions inside the outer perimeter of Syracuse. The panic was immediate and total. Citizens, who the night before had been celebrating, woke to the sound of military footsteps in their streets, to the gleam of metal in the grey light of dawn. Most fled toward the inner citadel, the highest and most heavily fortified part of the city. Hippocrates and Epicides tried to organize resistance. Archimedes' machines still stood at their positions on the walls, but they could not fire inward at the city itself. For the first time in 2 years, they were useless. The siege of the citadel lasted several more months. With all supply routes completely cut off and no hope of outside relief, The defenders held on until hunger broke them. An Iberian captain named Moriscus, one of the 3 prefects of Acradina, opened the gate by the fountains of Siracusa at the agreed signal during a diversionary attack, allowing the Romans final entry. Syracuse, the city that for 2 years had defied the most powerful army in the world, fell. Marcellus entered the city that had cost him so much. He stopped on a hill from which he could see all of Syracuse spread below him, and according to Plutarch, he wept. This was victory, but the price had been so high, the struggle so prolonged, that in that moment of triumph, what the Roman general felt was something closer to grief than celebration. He gave 2 orders in rapid succession. He ordered the city to be sacked, and he ordered that Archimedes was not to be harmed. The sacking of Syracuse was brutal. Roman soldiers, frustrated and hardened by 2 years of siege, unleashed a ferocity that the ancient sources describe with horror. Temples stripped bare, houses destroyed, treasures accumulated over centuries of Greek prosperity loaded onto ships bound for Rome, people enslaved, corpses in the streets. Such was the price paid by a city that had chosen the wrong side in the greatest war of its age. Archimedes did not know the city had fallen, or perhaps he knew and paid it no mind. He was in his home, bent over the floor where he had drawn geometric figures, completely absorbed, completely deaf to the noise of the streets, to the glow of fire on the horizon, to the sound of military footsteps drawing near. A Roman soldier entered. What happened in that moment exists in several versions transmitted by the ancient sources. In the most widely known, the soldier ordered him to follow and be brought before Marcellus. Archimedes responded, without raising his eyes from his diagrams, that he needed to finish the problem before moving. The soldier, who did not know who this disheveled old man bent over some marks in the earth was, and who had no patience for the eccentricities of genius on a day of battle, killed him on the spot. In another version, Archimedes was on his way to see Marcellus carrying his mathematical instruments, and a soldier who saw the devices as potential plunder killed him to steal them. In a third, the soldier knew exactly who he was, and killed him for precisely that reason, as vengeance for the hundreds of Romans those machines had sent to the bottom of the great harbor. In every version, the result was the same. The man who for 2 years had made Syracuse impregnable, the most singular mind of his generation, the mathematician who had advanced humanity's understanding of calculus by 2 millennia, died at the hands of an anonymous soldier. When Marcellus received the news, the reaction Plutarch describes is revealing. The general was deeply grieved. He summoned the relatives of Archimedes and ensured they received honors. He ordered that the mathematician be buried with the dignity he deserved, and for the rest of his life he regarded that death as the stain on his victory, looking upon the soldier who had killed him as a man contaminated by a crime without expiation. Syracuse fell silent. The great harbor, scene of the battle of machines, reflected a quiet sky. The cranes of the claw stood motionless on the walls, their hooks hanging in the void like the arms of a sleeping giant. The catapults cooled their mechanisms. The sea, which for months had absorbed the impact of shattered ships and drowned bodies, returned to its ancient rhythm, indifferent. Above the harbor, Roman standards flew, where until yesterday the standards of Syracuse had flown. The fall of Syracuse in 212, before the Common Era, was one of the most significant turning points of the Second Punic War. With Sicily completely under Roman control, Carthage lost not only a strategic ally, but also its best platform for naval operations in the central Mediterranean. Hannibal, who continued to threaten Italy from the south, would be progressively cut off from reinforcements and resources. The war would not end immediately, but the fall of Syracuse marked the moment when the balance began to tilt irreversibly toward Rome. For the Hellenistic world, the sacking of Syracuse was something more than a military defeat. It was the unmistakable signal that Greek civilization, with its centuries of philosophy, art, and science, was being absorbed by a power that valued force over knowledge. Marcellus sent to Rome the sculptures, paintings, and artistic treasures of Syracuse. Polybius himself describes how those objects filled the streets of Rome, and how the Roman people, accustomed to a more austere aesthetic, gazed upon them with wonder. Syracuse Hellenized Rome as much as Rome conquered Syracuse. But the most lasting legacy of that siege was neither political nor artistic. It was intellectual. Archimedes left behind writings that survived in copies and copies of copies for more than 2,000 years, transmitted through the medieval Islamic world and the European Renaissance all the way to our own time. His demonstrations on the area of the circle, the volume of the sphere, the nature of mathematical infinity. His method of exhaustion, precursor to integral calculus. His work on hydrostatics and the principle that bears his name, that a body submerged in a fluid experiences an upward force equal to the weight of the fluid it displaces. All of this survived. And when in the 17th century European mathematicians were constructing differential and integral calculus, they were building on foundations that Archimedes had laid 20 centuries before. The claw of Archimedes and his catapults also established a precedent no military commander could again afford to ignore. Technology can compensate for numerical disparity. A small number of well-designed machines, operated by men who understood their principles, could hold back for months the most powerful military force on the planet, a lesson that humanity would learn and forget, and learn again in every subsequent century. That ingenuity, applied with precision, is more powerful than brute force. There is something profoundly melancholy in the final image of Archimedes, a 75-year-old man in a besieged city, unable to stop thinking even as the world around him burned, tracing figures on the floor until the very last moment. Not heroism in the martial sense, not the courage of sword and shield, something stranger and more moving, absolute fidelity to the life of thought, even in the face of death. As if in that final instant, while the Roman soldier raised his weapon, the mind of Archimedes was somewhere else entirely, solving the last problem in an endless series, sailing in that universe of perfect forms where war and time hold no power whatsoever. Marcellus wept over the ashes of Syracuse. Perhaps he wept for the city he had destroyed, for the wealth turned to ruins, for the lives consumed on both sides through 2 years of siege. Or perhaps he wept, without quite knowing it himself, for something harder to name, the understanding that he had removed from the world a being that would not exist again. That the kind of mind that inhabited Archimedes is not a renewable resource. It appears once in a generation, or in 2, or in 10, and when it is extinguished, the world grows a little darker. Though no one can point to exactly where the shadow falls, 2,200 years later, his theorems are still true. His principles still work. His name is still spoken in every classroom, in every laboratory, in every equation that attempts to describe the world with the precision he was the first to dare to dream. The claw is dust. The walls of Syracuse are ruins beneath the Sicilian sun, but the parabola he traced has not ended, because the question his story hurls across the centuries is not how Syracuse fell. It is what we lose when we allow to die what we are not capable of recognizing. And the echo of that figure bent over his diagrams, indifferent to the noise of the world, resounds again every time a human being forgets to eat because they are too busy thinking.